Welcome to Viewmaster Travels. I'm Dave, and I've collected thousands of vintage Viewmaster reels that have 3D pictures of fascinating places from around the world. I started to wonder what these places were like today, so I'm on a quest to visit them, see what's there now, and learn some history along the way. Today we're visiting the actual locations from vintage Viewmaster set 5561 LincolnLand. It's a 3-reel set with booklet published in 1971. In looking at this, my first thought was, what is LincolnLand? Is it an Abraham Lincoln amusement park or something? Googling LincolnLand didn't find much, a college in Springfield, Illinois, and a car dealer, which struck me as weird. I know the Viewmaster is 50 years old now, but had LincolnLand closed? I did find this review of the 2005 opening of the Lincoln Museum in Springfield, Illinois, calling it LincolnLand, but he meant it was too Disney, like an indoor theme park. Seems they don't use that term anymore, which made me wonder how many of these Viewmaster locations were still there. The packet had a map with all the locations marked, so we followed Route 66 from Chicago to Springfield to see what we could find. Here was our first stop, the Rutledge-Camron Saw and Grist Mill. This mill is on the site of New Salem, 15 miles northwest of Springfield. Founded in 1829, it was a small frontier village built on the Sangamon River. Abraham Lincoln moved here when he was 21. He lived here for 4 years, helping to run the general store. He eventually purchased the store and became postmaster of the town, but times got hard after the county seat was established in a different town and because larger steamships had trouble reaching the area. His store quickly failed. Broke and in debt, he moved to Springfield in 1835 after just 4 years in New Salem, and the entire town was abandoned just 5 years after. Lincoln was assassinated 25 years later, and by then the town was just an empty field. The locals who knew its famous history carved the name Lincoln in nearby trees and put signs on the old basement depressions showing who owned the buildings that used to be there. New Salem's eventual restoration was due to something called the Chautauqua, which was a really popular entertainment and educational group from 1873. They gave outdoor tent-based revival-style lectures in rural communities. In 1906, newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst gave a lecture at the Old Salem Chautauqua and became interested in the site, eventually buying the entire property and giving it to the organization. They found the original Cooper shop building and moved it back onto the site, and then carefully began reconstructing all the other buildings, opening it as a living museum in 1921. By the 1940s, it was the second most visited Lincoln site in the world, and the heart of what would become LincolnLand. Putting this in context, federal funding for public works was at an all-time high after World War I, initially to build roads like the Lincoln Highway, but also to build destinations like New Salem. Lincoln-related attractions boomed, and most tourism boosters named their regions LincolnLand, and the most prominently advertised LincolnLand was Central Illinois. But when these Viewmaster pictures were taken in 1970, the New Salem Museum was 50 years old and in bad shape. It was approaching irreversible damage due to lack of maintenance. The next year, it was listed on the National Registry of Historic Places, giving it a boost of funding and protection, helping to save the site. Today, another 50 years have passed. The site is still amazing and fun to explore. We had a great time searching for each picture and talking to the people there. The grist mill we were looking for was the longest hike through the woods and turned out to be inaccessible. We ended up asking the local school teacher where it was. That made me wonder, what good was a Lincoln landmark if you couldn't find it? And Rutledge Grave at Petersburg, Illinois. This gravesite isn't marked on any of the period guides I had, so I'm not sure how easy it was to find at the time, but some quick Googling led us here to Oakland Cemetery, and the grave is very well marked, but the site has a bit of a morbid history. Anne Rutledge was born in 1813 and was the daughter of the founder of New Salem. Lincoln fell in love with Rutledge and they intended to get married, but she died of typhoid when she was only 22 years old. She was buried in an unmarked grave in a private cemetery. Years later, a man named Sam Montgomery, who owned the Oakland Cemetery in Petersburg, had a problem. He wasn't selling enough plots in his cemetery and his mortuary business was struggling. He had a brilliant idea. In 1890, a 10-volume biography of Abraham Lincoln was published, and perhaps capitalizing on the Lincoln publicity, he decided to dig up Lincoln's first love and move her bones to his cemetery. He got permission from her family, found the unmarked grave, and dug it up, but only managed to find a couple bones and other articles. He buried the bones in his cemetery, built a large gravestone, and marked it well, hoping people would buy plots there so they could be laid to rest near Lincoln's first love. 80 years later, even our viewmaster photographer visited this shrine, but I wonder if he knew its history. Today, the site is 110 years old and mostly unchanged. I kind of wonder if this tree was planted when she was moved. It seems creating LincolnLand sites to cash in on Lincoln excitement is nothing new. Here's our next objective. Clayville Stagecoach Stop, Pleasant Plains. This one is in our vintage tour book, and was easy enough to find. It's here, outside Springfield, on the old Stagecoach Road. Originally named the Broadwell Inn, it was built in 1824 by Revolutionary War veteran Moses Broadwell, and is one of the oldest brick buildings in the county. In 1961, Dr. Emmett and Mary Pearson bought the property to restore it. They added several additional period buildings and began running it as a museum. There didn't seem to be much connection to Lincoln, though. He may have been a guest at the inn or ridden the stagecoach from there, but that's it. Our viewmaster photographer visited around 1970, and I was noticing that most of these heritage sites had been purchased or restored right around then. I think part of this heritage tourism boom was due to the recently passed National Historic Preservation Act in 1966. At that time, there was a list of historic buildings in the U.S. listing 12,000 important locations, but due to rapid post-war development, by 1966, half of them had been destroyed. The NHPA created the National Register of Historic Places, which gave protection and funding to these sites. I think this helped pave the way for private individuals to take on the risk of investing in these places. The Pearsons inquired about getting their museum listed in 1970, but approval didn't come for 3 years. In the meantime, they had to donate the site to a local university, and it eventually fell into disuse and in 2007 was listed as one of the 10 most endangered historical sites in Illinois. In 2010, a society was formed to purchase and preserve the site. But there was no one there when we visited, although the structures looked to be in good shape and the site well maintained. It did make me wonder if all the LincolnLand sites were struggling like this. From this depot, Lincoln in 1861 left for the White House. Again, easy to find, and obviously still on the tour today. This train depot was originally constructed in 1852 by the Great Western Railroad. It was from here that Lincoln left for Washington, and from here his funeral procession began after he returned. It was purchased during the heritage tourism boom of the 1960s, and a local group ran it as a museum. After our Viewmaster photographer visited in the early 70s, the museum struggled financially, and it was eventually sold to the Copley Newspaper Press, which is across the street. It was used by the local university until 1980, after which it seems to have fallen into disuse. Finally, in 2012, it was purchased by a local lawyer who moved his offices to the upper floor and opened the lower as a museum again. It was added to the National Register in 2014, and the law office is partnering with the National Park Service to run this site. It occurred to me then that maintaining historic sites is a very long-term commitment, perhaps more than most private owners could handle. Our next stop was back in the city. Lincoln served in Old State Capitol, Springfield. This is the old Illinois State Capitol building in Springfield, which was the third capital city of Illinois. The first capital, when Illinois was still only a territory, was in Kaskaskia, now almost a ghost town. It's on the Mississippi River, which flooded Kaskaskia and eventually shifted course to the east, separating the town from the rest of the state, making it Illinois' only exclave. The second capital city was Vandalia, but then in 1840, and due to the efforts of Abraham Lincoln, the capital was moved to Springfield. At the time, Lincoln was a popular and successful lawyer in town and pleaded many cases in this building. He gave one of his most famous speeches here, and after his death, was laid in state here before being buried. Eventually, the Illinois government outgrew the building, and it became a courthouse and remained so for almost 100 years. By 1960, Lincoln and the Civil War were almost 100 years in the past, and that centennial was generating a lot of interest. It was then that architect Earl Henderson met state historian Clyde Walton, who then worked with Illinois Governor Otto Kerner on a plan to restore the Capitol building. Governor Kerner knew the importance of tourism and acting while interest was high. He told the local construction companies, "Smokestacks is not your industry, it's tourism." Over the next 4 years, they dismantled the existing courthouse brick by brick, storing the bricks in the county fairgrounds. They rebuilt the interior as it was in Lincoln's day, and then reassembled the exterior like a giant jigsaw puzzle. The restored Capitol opened in 1969, just a year or so before the Viewmaster picture was taken. Today, more than 50 years later, we found ourselves exploring the beautiful building as well. It wasn't very busy at the time. Apparently, the Windy City tour group was yet to arrive. And we spent quite some time talking with the local docent about rare maps they had on the wall. When we were done exploring, our next stop was right outside. Lincoln and his partner Herndon had their law office here. Lincoln's law office is in the building right across the street from the old Capitol. There's a little thrill walking over, since Lincoln would have walked the exact same way to court each day. The building was originally built in 1840 by Seth Tinsley, a local merchant, and Lincoln rented rooms on the third floor. And here's an interesting fact. Lincoln fought a duel with one of the building's other tenants, State Auditor James Shields. Lincoln had criticized Shields' handling of the closing of the Illinois State Bank. Shields challenged Lincoln to a duel, and they met on Bloody Island in the Mississippi River. Sitting between Illinois and Missouri, it was governed by neither. Lincoln could pick which weapons to use and chose a saber, since he knew he could outreach Shields, and when Shields saw Lincoln's advantage, he gave in, and eventually they became good friends. The building was purchased by a group of local people, including James Myers, who literally wrote the book on Lincoln's duel, and it was restored, like most of these sites, in the late 60s. Looks like they ran the upstairs as a museum, but the lower floors as retail space, which I'm sure helped keep the cash flow positive. In the 1980s, the property was transferred to the state, and in the 2000s, it underwent a $1 million renovation. When we visited, the Tourist Information Center was in the main section, and the reproduction of Lincoln's office was downstairs. The upstairs was under renovation again. Leaving the office, we took what may be the most famous Lincoln-related commute you can take, from his office to the Springfield home of Abe and Mary Todd Lincoln. Lincoln's home was built in 1839, and Lincoln purchased it in 1844. He lived here until he left for Washington. Eventually, Lincoln's son donated the home to the state in 1887. It was already a local attraction, and he wanted the state to preserve the site. In 1966, it was immediately listed on the Registry of Historic Places since it was on the list of known historical landmarks. But at that time, the area surrounding the building was threatened by local developers wanting to build tourist attractions nearby. One was an 11-story simulated log cabin tower hotel, and the city had no zoning laws to prevent this. In 1967, Earl W. Henderson, chairman of the Historical Sites Commission, began a campaign to work with Congress to protect the site. And in 1969, Representative Paul Findley passed a bill protecting the entire area, enabling the state to prevent new development there. That also meant they could force out some existing private businesses, like our next goal. Lincoln Museum, across street from home. When the Viewmaster picture was taken, the building across the street from the Lincoln home was the Abraham Lincoln Museum, a privately owned museum and gift shop. But at exactly that time, congressional hearings were underway as the state tried to determine the fate of the business. It was purchased by Hugh Garvey in 1955, and he created the museum there. And by 1971, he had invested over $400,000 into his business. Since they now controlled the area, the state offered to pay him only $200,000 to purchase his properties and close his business. This was finally settled 6 years later, and looking at the deed transfer records, Garvey eventually got his investment back. Today the building's being used as a small museum, and I'm glad they treated Garvey fairly. Lincoln's home is one of the most popular attractions in LincolnLand, second only perhaps to our final destination. Lincoln's tomb in Oak Ridge Cemetery, Springfield. When Lincoln's body was returned to Springfield, it was held in a receiving vault in Oak Ridge Cemetery. A lot of money was raised from across the country, and over the next 6 years, a proper tomb was constructed and Lincoln's body moved into it. As you can see, even today, Lincoln's tomb is a very popular destination. The tour bus did beat us here. The tomb has several rooms filled with various replicas of Lincoln statues from around the world, and a marble memorial surrounded by the flags of places connected to Lincoln. When the Viewmaster pictures were taken, the tomb would have been managed by a custodian, who would likely have given guided tours. The most famous custodian was Herbert Well Fay, who oversaw the tomb from 1921 through 1949. He kept his enormous collection of Lincoln artifacts in the tomb and ran the place like a museum. He was quite the marketeer, putting clickbait headlines above his exhibits like Lincoln's Blood, Ask How and Why It Came Here, and hiring a local schoolchild who would recite the Gettysburg Address for a quarter. Fay was very influential in bringing tourists to LincolnLand. He produced and distributed some of the very first guidebooks in 1928 and contributed pictures of articles from his collection to the books. He said the state didn't appreciate its Lincoln advantage enough. The last custodian of the tomb, the one who would have been there when the Viewmaster photographer was there, was George Cashman, who cared for the tomb until 1975. He owned a camera shop in downtown Springfield and continued the tradition of distributing the LincolnLand guidebooks. Even 2 centuries ago, you can see how important passionate local people were in creating and maintaining historic landmarks. That's it for our whirlwind tour of LincolnLand. Exploring these historic sites really gave me an appreciation for how difficult their maintenance is. These sites need to be preserved over many generations, and that kind of long-term commitment requires the involvement of hundreds of people from the community, as well as support from the state and local governments. As always, there's much more to see in LincolnLand, but that's it for now. Thanks for watching.